You're listening to Eyes on the Ground. I'm Slade Ham, comedian, writer, explorer. I'll be your host. My guest on this episode is comedian Andy Huggins, an original member of the famed Texas Outlaw Comics and a recent standout on America's Got Talent. Andy is one of the most diligent writer-performers in the game. Andy has, by far, the longest career of any artist on this season. He began in Virginia in 1977. That's basically my entire life, before heading to Los Angeles later that year, which was a brazen move in an industry that was barely even an industry yet. There's a lot of history in those 43 years and a lot of knowledge too. But before we get to all the technical talk, the comic in me couldn't resist asking what the stand-up comedy scene looked like in the 1970s.
It was relegated to the late shows. And actually, I didn't stay up and watch The Tonight Show too often. Is Ed Sullivan. All the comics, you know, this popular discussion, your Mount Rushmore of this, your Mount Rushmore of that.
Oh, yes.
I was thinking one time, my Mount Rushmore of comics, and if it was comics that were influential and important to me, one of them I decided would have to be some representative of the Ed Sullivan Show, those comics. Mm-hmm. I just loved those guys. They did jokes. So that's where I saw stand-up was on Ed Sullivan, and then the afternoon shows, Merv Griffin, Dinah Shore. A lot of your listeners are going to have to be Googling these names. But Mike Douglas, and so that's where I saw him, was on TV. There was no clubs. I was living in Charlottesville, Virginia. A couple of times I took a trip up to Washington, D.C. to a club called the Cellar Door, which was a wonderful club. And I saw Richard Pryor there 3 times within 9 months. But yeah, other than that, there were no comedy clubs. I wasn't face-to-face with another actual comic till I went out to the Comedy Store in late 77.
Explain to me the comedy scene in Los Angeles when you arrived.
For me, it centered around the Comedy Store. I didn't get to the Improv hardly at all, but the store, that's where it was happening. That was about at its peak as far as, because that's where Pryor worked out his CDs, albums, and Letterman, Leno, right before Letterman jumped into TV. It's the most exciting place to be on a Saturday night backstage at the Comedy Store. I didn't get any weekend spots at the original room, but I was allowed to hang out because I was a regular and just surrounded by all these folks that 4 months earlier I'd been watching on TV. And the great thing was most of those people, Leno and Letterman and Elaine Boozler and Richard Lewis and Steve Landisberg, they were all very considerate and solicitous of how you were doing. They never talked about themselves. If you went, "Hey Dave, what's going on?" he wouldn't give you his next month's schedule. He'd ask how you were doing. You're writing, is Mitzi giving you any stage time? So yeah, to be immediately accepted, and we're talking, I've been doing, I probably didn't have a dozen stage appearances when I first started hanging out there. And it didn't matter to them. We were all comics.
All right. We've established that he's been here since comedy was an infant. What I'm interested in, though, is output. And I'm sure you do as well, know plenty of artists who aloofly pretend that their work is effortless, that the ideas come to them in waves, that they rarely bother with erasers, blah, blah, blah. And I can't speak for everybody, but that has never been my experience. I recognize that if I'm going to make anything cool, it's going to require a ton of actual work. The creative mind is a complicated machine, and that means a lot of trial and error. A lot of trial and error means a lot of failure, and a lot of failure means, well, you better get used to it. To that end, Andy and I share a similar belief, which we'll expound upon right here at the beginning, that our creative blocks aren't necessarily as debilitating as we think.
What I do as far as writer's block goes, like I say, I just start writing. In a way, to me, writer's block is a non-existent problem because you can always write. I think what most people mean when they say writer's block is I haven't written anything funny. One of the guiding principles I have when it comes to writing, and I've looked for the quote online to see if I could find the author. But what this person said, and he was a novelist, as I recall, you got to write every day because most of what you're going to write is crap and you just got to get it out of your system. So that's one, I have had more than a few days where I just sat down and came up with 4 or 5 jokes that weren't funny at all. But I tell myself, okay, got that out of my system.
Isn't that liberating? As I'm pecking away at the new book, there are days, and some of you may find this very refreshing to hear. There are days that I type 3, 4, 5,000 words, and I get to the end, and that's a lot of print. Those are big long stories, and I get to the end, and I realize that I would never put this out to the world in a billion years. 6 hours in a coffee shop and an entire day, and it used to madden me. It used to be one of those things where you just throw the notebook in the trash and you go, that's it, I'm done. I don't belong in this industry. And now it is like you kind of said.
Well, both of us have been writing books or jokes long enough to know that we can write a joke.
Mm-hmm.
Jose Altuve can go 0 for 7 in a doubleheader. He's not quitting.
Right.
He's going to get up there the next day and get his share of hits. And that's how I feel like about jokes. I'm going to go 0 for 7 some days. And, well, I tell you what, you look back, I'll save some of those jokes in that index card box. What the hell were you thinking? What the hell were you thinking? I mean, it looks like a joke. It's in English. It's complete sentences.
My organization system it's functional, but it is chaos. It is multiple notebooks in Evernote and a series of places that I'm never more than 3 feet away from a notebook. I can always capture an idea. The problem is when I go back to revisit them, I oftentimes can't remember, because I'll put down, I don't write in enough detail. Yeah. When I go, I'll remember this if I just write down a couple of keywords. And I've trained myself now to write down so much more detail and so much more than I thought I was going to need to recall the entirety of the idea.
Do you, the initial writing, first draft, is that notebook or are you on the keyboard?
No, it's everything's notebook initially. I am very, very analog in that regard. I can't search.
I can't think at the keyboard.
I've tried. I can in prose when I'm writing the book. That is all digital. I type. I don't write fast enough to keep up with my brain. I do type. If you read my notebook, the way I write when I'm trying to capture live, it is it's a series of. I almost just squiggle my pen and then cross or dot. I do all the high and low parts. Like I'll drop my pen down where a G would go, or I'll put a cross where a T should go. But there's no actual reading the words. So it's just for me to capture and then transfer over to something that's a little more legible almost immediately.
Yeah, I like just the physical act of ballpoint pen.
It feels
on
right.
paper. I like the way it looks. I like the feel of it. And I've never, like I said, I've never been able to think and type.
What is writing? What does a day of writing look like to Andy Huggins? Give me what it looks like in the process, and then give me what the results look like that satisfy you.
Well, for those that don't know, or you just heard, but I do one-liners. Mm-hmm. Premise, set up punchline, set up punchline, set up punchline. So the first step is to come up with a topic and since it's one-liners, it has to be like kind of a narrow topic. And then, sometimes you know what the punchline is, and you got to work backwards to come up with just the right setup so that it makes sense. And sometimes you just, you come up with the topic and you say, well, what's funny about this? And, the self-quarantine, has just all sorts of possibilities. But sometimes you have the punchline and you work your way backwards. Every once in a while you're blessed with an inspiration and the joke just writes itself. A lot of times you can't wait for the muse to show up. You got an act you got to write. So a lot of times I just like I say, grind it out. I'll reword the setup, hoping that leads me to the punchline. Or like I say, sometimes I start with the punchline, work my way backward.
Once you have what you consider a solid bit, a setup exists, a premise exists, a punchline exists. You have a piece that hey, there's funny here.
Yeah.
After that, how much play happens with? I've heard so many stories, and personally, I can speak to the economy of words and how, maybe a joke that is, especially in short form, 25 words. Do you focus and fixate on the fact that you could probably do it in 20? Do you just intuitively go, oh, all the dead weight's already gone?
I used to be real focused on the number of words in a given setup punchline. And for some reason, the conciseness was 14 words. Now I've kind of gotten away from that because I thought maybe I was just being a little too rigid in my editing. Just let it flow a little bit, give it a little bit of air to breathe. But for me, when I rewrite a joke, 9 times out of 10, I'm taking words out.
We talk a lot in stand-up comedy. There's a vernacular that not everyone may recognize. The term LPM comes up a lot, laughs per minute. Explain that concept to me.
I kind of annoyed by the whole idea. I spent 35 years never even thinking about how many laughs per minute I'm getting. What I was concerned was with every laugh, every joke I did, I wanted to get a laugh, and everybody has their own natural pacing, their own natural rhythm. So it's going to differ. Audiences don't know. Audiences aren't going to say, well, he's pretty funny, but he was only getting 6 laughs per minute, and the guy last week, I suspect, other than talent coordinators who, it's a way to, if you bring statistics, if you bring sabermetrics into stand-up comedy, now you got that gets the guy off the hook or the lady off the hook, whoever the talent, they don't have to make a gut call.
Right.
What they can do is say, well, statistically, you're not up to par. The other thing about LPMs, you're penalized if you get big laughs. You can't do another joke while you're waiting for a big laugh to die down. So the question then becomes, do you want, in a given minute, do you want 6 okay laughs? But what was it, maybe 5-6 years ago, this became a big topic. So I went to different sets and all kinds of different sets and different types of shows and different lengths of shows, 5-minute sets, half-hour sets. It's fucking 6 laughs per minute for me. You know what that is? That's the exact number of laughs I ought to be getting per minute, given the number of jokes.
I should mention that Andy is a pure stand-up. The only deviations in a nearly half-century-long career have been self-chosen sabbaticals taken when he needed to regroup, personally or professionally, which is something I cannot reinforce enough. Burnout, fatigue, those things kill careers. I'm a bigger fan of diversifying, reinventing, and taking breaks. So why did Andy take the pit stops he did?
I'm a little crazy in a very quiet way. I have some neuroses. 2004, I just lost enthusiasm for stand-up for a while, and I just thought, well, I need to get that creative spark back somehow. So I started auditioning for plays, and I caught on with this particular group, Company on Stage, which is still an ongoing concern. They're terrific people, and I've had a couple of people tell me that acting improved my stand-up just as a performer. I just became a more
interesting
animated, yeah, but so it helped. And but what I love about acting, it's the complete opposite of what I love about stand-up. In that, in acting, I love working with other people. I love not being the only person responsible for getting a laugh or moving the play forward. There are other people on stage. Somebody else has written it. I love rehearsing. On the other hand, with stand-up, it's just me, and that's great.
You mentioned something a second ago, and that becoming disenchanted with stand-up. I've been doing this for 20 years. To say I think about quitting frequently would be a lie. I think about quitting all the time, far more than frequently. Does that still needle at you? Do you still have moments where you go, I should be doing something else?
Yeah, I'm good to the finish now. I've had 2 periods. I went out to Los Angeles. I came to Houston in 81, and then in 91, I went back out there for about 2.5 years. And I didn't do any stand-up there. I was just looking for writing work, and I was completely comfortable not doing stand-up. Came back here in 94, back at it doing stand-up. And then in 2004, for whatever reason, and probably a couple of reasons, but I just decided I was, a lot of my guys had, scattered to the 4 winds or had died.
Right.
And so I think I was feeling kind of isolated in some sense. A lot of that my own doing. But I just set it aside. Came back in 2010 and as recharged as a person can be, enthusiastic, and I'm good to go till I drop.
Andy, if you had a piece of advice for the modern comic,
the one bit of advice that I give anybody, and I'll repeat it 3 or 4 times in an hour conversation: do what you think is funny, keep what the audience thinks is funny, and that's it. Trust your instincts. And then, believe the audience. The audience will tell you. That would be my advice. Audience tells you everything you want to know. You got to pay attention.
They're rarely wrong, aren't they?
No, they're never. Dangerfield said something to the effect that individually, audience members may be monkeys, but when you put them together, they're a genius.
It is 100%. I have found oftentimes, I could give you specific examples, but I'll speak generally, that I have presented things that I thought were wildly funny and been met by 300 stares who did not, collaborate about this in advance. They all on the fly looked at it and went, nope. And they're not incorrect. And I have also had lines, and I still do in my show, that to this day, Andy, I don't know why they work.
Yeah.
But
I have lines I don't know why they work as well as they do.
Right. Well, yeah. But
this is funny enough. That big a laugh? Okay. I'm not going to argue with you. No, it's disheartening to a degree. Is the number of would-be comics that just don't listen.
It's such a shame.
You would think that at a comedy show, at a stand-up open mic, that survival of the fittest, natural selection would be at its strongest.
It's amazing how long some of these creatures can live with no food.
Yeah, comedy defies natural selection.
Well, I have a theory, Andy, that comedy the way stand-up works is it attracts a type of person, because no one is good at stand-up organically. I think you'll agree when I say this is far from just being the funniest guy in the room.
No, it's an act. You have to have an act.
It is very deliberate, and that does not happen quickly. And no. I think stand-up attracts the type of person who can be delusional through those first 2 years. Because if you legitimately reacted to the reaction you got that you deserved in your first year or two, stand-up comedy would not be an art form. We would all quit very quickly. So I think it speaks to us that we're a certain type of just delusional through it all. Yeah. And it gives us the ability to sort of ignore what should be social cues and crowd response. And I think that's why we see that with a lot of stand-up comics now, where you go, how do you not hear the silence? There's a few people in Houston, and I won't name names, but that have been doing the same 7 minutes to the sound of no applause for 10 years or so. So that delusion is strong.
Yeah. Well, there are some people that think maybe the stand-up scene in Houston accommodates too many people, that it's overrun. My attitude is, everybody that wants to try it ought to try it. Bring everybody on, but listen to the fucking audience.
Back to the purity. You can get lost in the technical breakdown of any art. Laughs per minute, or brushstrokes, or pitch, or composition, those things matter, but only to a point. You can be technically perfect and still fail. There is a component of soul to it all, of doing what feels right. For instance, I'm a hobbyist when it comes to photo editing, but one of the first things I learned was always straighten the horizon. It really does change a photo, except sometimes a perfectly straight horizon just looks wrong. Why? No clue. But a degree or two off straight somehow corrects the way the images look. Technically wrong, practically though, 100%. It's a fancy way of saying learn the rules, then discard them when they don't apply. That's Andy with stand-up. So back to it. What is a good indicator that a young comic is on the right path?
Well, what I look for, and I was talking about this with somebody the other day, you know, when somebody's first starting out, they might be a real raggedy in their presentation, and they might not be real efficient yet in shaping a joke or shaping a bit. You can tell if somebody thinks funny. I'm not interested, and this isn't the only way to do it. This may not even be the best way of doing it. I'm only interested in laughs. I'm not interested in making a point. I'm not interested in being edgy, all caps, edgy. I just want laughs. So that's what I, when I watch a comic, that's what I prefer to watch. That's certainly how I perform. So that's what I look for. Do they think funny? Which means, are they going to get a lot of genuine laughs?
Do you have any interest in ever writing outside of stand-up? Are there things that you want to create that don't happen on stage with a microphone?
No. One time when I was out in Los Angeles, I did 2 different tours of duty in Los Angeles. And one time I was trying to write some spec scripts for different shows. I'd like to think that if I really hung in there and devoted time and energy to that I did to stand up, that maybe I'd been passable at one point. But initially I just I wasn't passable. It was pretty bad. I've written some short plays. I've written a couple of kids' plays, as a matter of fact.
What?
Between, when was it, 2004, 2010, I cut way back on the stand-up, and I became involved with a community theater here in Houston, and as acting. And at some point, I wrote 2 different children's plays that were produced. So,
really?
I have done, but I wouldn't.
That's not, Andy Huggins doesn't want to wake up in the morning and write children's plays. That's not your dream.
One was a Christmas play, and another one involved a princess and a witch, and it was fun, but that's not,
Were they comedies though?
Oh yeah. Funny enough.
Can I find a video of children doing Andy Huggins?
I've never seen a video. I hope. I'm 70 years old, and I just don't. I hope I got another at least 10 years left. But that's just 10 years. I don't want to spend time. I mean, I love stand-up, and stand-up loves me. It's exactly what I'm supposed to be doing on this earth, and I don't want to waste time. I rewrite a lot. And so if I were to take up any other project, it would just be rewrite. And that's time away from the stand-up.
I've intentionally saved any conversation about the Outlaw Comics until the end, mainly because I think Andy's story and his career both are completely self-contained. For the uninitiated, however, the Outlaw Comics were a Houston institution in the mid-'80s, a very formative time for stand-up comedy. Allow the comedy historian in me to nerd out for a bit. I asked Andy about the roster of the Outlaw Comics because I didn't think there was a definitive list.
I got an official list. Initially, and this was before I got to Houston, Steve Epstein produced a show called Comics on the Lam. It featured Sam and Bill, the great Carl LeBeau, the great Riley Barber. They did a show at one of the theaters, and the idea of the show was to finance their move to Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. From what I understand, financially, the show was a disaster. But evidently, it was real ugly. But they all 4 got out to Los Angeles eventually. So that was the initial. idea. But Epstein, that was probably 79, 80. Epstein around 84, 85 decided, let's put together a group. We'll call them the Texas Outlaw Comics. And that was Epi, Bill, Ron Schock, Riley Barber, John Fernetti, Jimmy Pineapple, and me. There were 7 of us. That was the group. Now, what happened down the road was that, we all went our separate ways. We were barely a group. We were a group in that we showed up at the right venue at the right hour and we did a show. But the group was kind of doomed from the start, I think, because there's just too many of those guys like Jimmy and Bill and Ron Schock. They weren't going to devote a lot of time and energy to a group. If it was convenient for them, they would go. But what would happen, Epi would produce what he'd call an outlaw show, and then he'd invite all kinds of people to that show. And I think some of those people decided they were an outlaw comic then and claimed that, put that on their resume. But the 7 I named, that was the group we did. We got an awful lot of mileage out of very little. The 2 I remember, and there might have been 3. We just didn't do that many shows, really. Outlaw Comics Get Religion, which I think we did at Fitzgerald's. And I forget what year it was, maybe 86, something like that. The year in review. It was a year in review type show. And I forget what year it was, 85, 86. We also did the best shows we did was at Rockefeller's. That I think those shows were where Bill's Elvis Presley impression peaked. So those 2 themes I remember, and then the Rockefeller shows were just comedy. I don't think there was any.
Tell me about Bill, because you and I have spoken about this before, and I keep meaning to ask you in some sort of public forum. A lot of what Bill Hicks's comedy, the Bill Hicks that exists now, that so many comics have chosen to almost deify. There's a specific sect of comics that do it, and I think it's very funny. I'm a fan of that era of Bill Hicks. I think he was a wildly brilliant monologist in those later years. I think he spoke to me more as a poet or a philosopher more than a comic in the recorded stuff. But you talk often about the Bill that isn't on the album, the Bill that talked about his family a lot, the Bill that was on the stage at the workshop so many nights, blowing the roof off of the place, and not with psychedelic philosophy, but with
comedy. Yeah, he was great. He was so funny. And everybody, I'm not real sure that if you took a survey of all the workshop comics back then, that they wouldn't vote for that Bill as opposed to Arena Bill.
Really?
I think so. And we all love what Bill did later, but we really loved what he did at the workshop in the early to mid 80s, talking about his family. And Bill eventually evolved into the Bill he was supposed to be.
Right.
The Bill that he became was the Bill he was always going to become at some point. So it was not only logical, but desirable. On Facebook, I counted one. There must be 24 pages dedicated to Bill or some aspect of it. And when those, and God bless him, but when those folks quote Bill, it's very rarely a joke or a bit. They quote his philosophy. He was writing for a publication in Great Britain for a while. And I assume a lot of those quotes are pulled from those articles, his philosophical thoughts, his observations. They never quote the joke.
They never get to the comedy part of Bill, and I think that's such a tragedy. And I think
who's the real loser, Bill? That's my favorite line.
And who would recognize a great line better than Andy? This conversation was a great reminder to me that we can get through most creative problems with pure stubbornness, that we can write right past the roadblocks, that we can dig out of our creative prisons with a spoon if we have to. Andy makes me want to forget everything I thought I knew and go back to when comedy was just being funny on stage before all the overthinking and analyzing. It's something I've gotten even closer to as I work on my new hour, as I remind myself that before what I'm saying on stage can be anything, it has to be funny. Follow Andy Huggins on all things social media at Andy Huggins. Or get his album, Inspired by True Events, available now wherever you get your music. Eyes on the Ground is produced by me, Slade Ham. Additional production and music provided by Brian Carrion. To support future projects like this, please consider contributing to my Patreon or subscribing to me on all things social media at Slade Ham. SLADE HAM.